For thousands of pioneers, the Oregon Trail was the ultimate road to a new life. But it was also a path filled with deadly challenges. How many actually made it? And what was the journey really like? When we think of the Oregon Trail, it's easy to picture covered wagons rolling westward, families seeking a better life, and the promise of opportunity. But behind this image was one of the most grueling and dangerous migrations in history. From deadly diseases and starvation to treacherous river crossings and brutal weather, the pioneers who took this journey risked everything, and not all of them survived. Why it matters. The Oregon Trail was one of the most significant migrations in American history, shaping the future of the American West. Over 400,000 pioneers made the perilous journey between the 1830s and the 1860s, seeking land, fortune, and a fresh start. This mass migration transformed the Western landscape, leading to the establishment of key settlements that would later become major cities. The Oregon Trail was part of manifest destiny, the idea that Americans were destined to expand across the continent. But the journey had devastating consequences, not just for the settlers who perished along the way, but also for Native American communities, whose lands and ways of life were forever changed by westward expansion. What this video will uncover: what was it really like to travel the Oregon Trail? The brutal hardships, cholera outbreaks, wagon accidents, extreme weather, and food shortages. The survival stories, who made it, who didn't, and how some defied. The odds. The real historical impact, how this migration shaped America, for better and for worse. This is the untold story of the Oregon Trail, beyond the legend, beyond the myths, and into the reality of one of the most dangerous journeys in American history. Why the Oregon Trail existed. The Oregon Trail didn't just appear overnight. It was the result of decades of exploration, economic ambition, and a growing belief that America was destined to expand westward. But what exactly drove hundreds of thousands of people to leave behind everything they knew and set out on a perilous journey into the unknown? The idea of manifest destiny, a nation's fate in the West. In the early 19th century, the United States was rapidly expanding and a powerful idea took hold: manifest destiny. This was the belief that Americans were destined, perhaps even divinely chosen, to expand westward across the North American continent. The vast untamed lands of the West were seen as both a promise and a challenge. Economic opportunity, land. In the East was becoming expensive, while the West offered millions of acres of fertile farmland, a chance for struggling families to start over. Religious and missionary goals. Christian missionaries sought to spread their faith to indigenous communities. Political and strategic control. The U.S. government encouraged expansion to prevent Britain, Mexico, and other foreign powers from claiming Western lands. The gold rush and frontier dreams. Though the famous California gold rush wouldn't happen until 1849, rumors of wealth and new opportunities drew adventurous spirits westward. But before settlers could reach this promised land, they needed a way to get there. The first pathfinders, early explorers and fur traders. Before wagon trains and pioneers, the West was a rugged and dangerous wilderness, explored only by Native American tribes and a handful of fur traders and adventurers. Lewis and Clark Expedition, 1804-1806, sent by President Thomas Jefferson, explorers Meriwether Lewis and William Clark became the first Americans to map a route to the Pacific. Their journey proved that reaching the West was possible, but it was far from easy. John Jacob Astor's Pacific Fur Company, 1811-1813. Astor, a wealthy businessman, established Fort Astoria in present-day Oregon, sending trading expeditions overland to connect with the Pacific Northwest. His fur traders, often known as mountain men, were among the first non-native people to navigate the rugged western trails. These early expeditions blazed paths through mountains, rivers, and prairies, and their maps and knowledge would later guide settlers toward the Oregon Trail. The first pioneers, the Whitman Mission, 1836. While fur traders had already ventured west, few ordinary settlers attempted the dangerous trip until Marcus and Narcissa Whitman made history in 1836. Marcus Whitman, a doctor, and his wife Narcissa a teacher, set out with a small group of missionaries to establish a Christian mission among the Cayuse people in what is now Walla Walla, Washington. They traveled with wagons, proving that the difficult journey could be done on wheels, not just on horseback or foot. Their mission, however, ended in tragedy. After an outbreak of measles devastated the local Cayuse community, tensions boiled over, leading to the Whitman Massacre in 1847. Despite their fate, the Whitman's journey was a turning point. They had opened the floodgates, showing Americans that westward migration was possible. By the 1840s, the Oregon Trail would become one of the busiest highways in history, carrying entire families, farmers, and dreamers into the great unknown. The beginning of an epic journey. What started as a path for explorers and fur traders soon became the road for pioneers seeking a better life. But what lay ahead was a journey filled with unimaginable challenges, deadly diseases, brutal weather, and life-or-death decisions. In the next section, we'll dive into the harsh realities of traveling the Oregon Trail, where every mile could mean the difference between survival and tragedy. The journey begins, life on the trail, the decision. To leave behind everything and travel west was not made lightly. Those who set out on the Oregon Trail were chasing dreams of fertile farmland, new opportunities, and a fresh start. But before they could reach the promised land, they had to survive one of the most grueling journeys in American history, a 2,170-mile trek through mountains, rivers, and unforgiving terrain. Who traveled the trail? Contrary to popular belief, the Oregon Trail wasn't just filled with young, adventurous men. The majority of travelers were families. Farmers seeking cheap, fertile land. Families wanting a better life for their children. Merchants and tradespeople, hoping to establish businesses in the West. Missionaries eager to spread Christianity to Native American tribes. Fortune seekers drawn by the lure of opportunity, especially as the California Gold Rush, 1849, approached. Many were middle-class Americans from states like Missouri, Illinois, and Kentucky, selling everything they owned to fund the expensive journey. The cost to outfit a family of 4? Around $1,000, a fortune in the 1840s. But money alone couldn't guarantee survival. Those who were unprepared faced deadly consequences. The dangers of being unprepared. Many pioneers underestimated the dangers of the trail, assuming they could simply pack up and go. This mistake often cost lives. Overloaded wagons, many families. Packed too much, leading to broken wagons, abandoned supplies, and wasted energy. Lack of survival skills. Some had never even fired a gun or butchered an animal, leaving them vulnerable to starvation and wild animals. Poor route planning. Some groups took shortcut routes, like the infamous Hastings Cutoff, that led them into deadly traps, as seen with the Donner Party in 1846. Disease. The biggest killer on the Oregon Trail wasn't Native American attacks or wild animals, it was disease. Cholera, dysentery, and smallpox wiped out entire wagon parties. Pioneers had to learn quickly, or they wouldn't survive. The route and distance, 2,170 miles of hardship. The Oregon Trail was no small journey. It stretched an astonishing 2,170 miles from Independence, Missouri, to the Willamette Valley in Oregon. Depending on conditions, the trip could take 4 to 6 months. Key landmarks along the way. Independence, Missouri, the official starting point. Here, families gathered supplies and joined wagon trains for protection. Fort Kearny and Fort Laramie, crucial rest stops where pioneers could trade, repair wagons, and gather information. Chimney Rock and Scotts Bluff, famous natural landmarks that told pioneers they were still on the right track. South Pass, Wyoming, the most critical point of the journey. This was the safest route through the Rocky Mountains. Snake River and Columbia River. The final leg of the journey, where travelers faced dangerous river crossings before reaching Oregon. These landmarks weren't just guideposts. They were also places where pioneers buried loved ones, abandoned, broken wagons, and made heartbreaking decisions. The covered wagon. Myth. What was travel really like? Hollywood and old Western paintings often show families riding in covered wagons across the plains. But the reality? Most people walked the entire journey. The truth about covered wagons were small and uncomfortable, about 4 feet wide and 10 feet long, barely enough room for food, tools, and supplies. Instead of riding, most pioneers walked beside their wagons, covering 15 to 20 miles a day. Wagons were pulled by oxen, not horses, because oxen were stronger and could survive on the limited prairie grass. A typical day started before sunrise, with travelers walking from dawn until dusk, stopping only to rest and eat. Shoes wore out quickly, and many pioneers walked barefoot for miles to conserve supplies. The harsh reality of the trail. The Oregon Trail was not a scenic adventure. It was a brutal test of endurance. Every day, travelers faced sudden storms and floods that could wash away wagons, extreme heat and cold, making survival nearly impossible in some regions, treacherous river crossings, where hundreds of people and animals drowned, bandits and outlaws who targeted vulnerable wagon parties. And yet, despite the dangers, thousands pushed forward, driven by hope, determination, and the dream of a better future. The journey continues. Reaching the halfway point was an achievement, but the most treacherous challenges were still ahead. In the next section, we'll uncover the deadliest dangers pioneers faced, the acts of heroism and sacrifice, and the survival stories that defined the Oregon Trail. The Oregon Trail was a path to opportunity, but it was also a gauntlet of dangers. For many pioneers, survival was a daily battle against disease, unpredictable weather, and tragic accidents. Every mile brought new threats, and not everyone would make it to Oregon. The deadliest enemy on the trail wasn't attacks or starvation, it was disease. Cholera, dysentery, and smallpox spread rapidly through wagon trains, killing thousands. With no doctors and poor sanitation, even a small cut could become infected and lead to death. Contaminated water sources, often shared with livestock, made outbreaks even worse. Once symptoms appeared, victims rarely survived more than a day or two. Some wagon trains buried multiple people every morning before continuing on. It wasn't uncommon to see makeshift graves along the trail, marked only by wooden crosses or simple stones. River crossings were some of the most dangerous moments of the journey. Many rivers were swollen with spring runoff, making them treacherous to cross. Pioneers had to decide whether to ford the river, build makeshift rafts, or wait for the water levels to drop. None of these options were safe. Wagons tipped over, animals drowned, and many pioneers were swept away in the current. Families often lost everything when their supplies and belongings sank to the bottom of a river. Weather on the trail was unpredictable and often extreme. Pioneers endured scorching summer heat, violent thunderstorms, and sudden blizzards in the mountains. Exposure was deadly, especially for children and the elderly. In some years, early snow trapped wagon trains in the mountains, forcing them to resort to desperate measures to survive. Even a sudden hailstorm could injure livestock and travelers, leaving them stranded miles from help. Accidents were an everyday occurrence. Wagons were heavy and difficult to control, leading to crushed limbs and fatal injuries. Children playing near the wheels were sometimes run over. Firearms were essential for hunting and protection, but many pioneers had little experience using them. Gun accidents were common, often happening while loading or cleaning weapons. Snake bites, particularly from rattlesnakes, added another layer of danger, and with no medical treatment available, a bite could be fatal. The Oregon Trail was a journey of hope and ambition, but it was also one of relentless hardship. Every mile tested the endurance, strength, and survival skills of the pioneers who braved it. While many set out with dreams of a better life in the West, the brutal realities of the trail often turned their dreams into nightmares. Disease, natural disasters, deadly river crossings, and tragic accidents claimed thousands of lives, leaving behind a landscape marked by uncounted graves and shattered families. Disease, the invisible killer of the trail. Despite the many physical dangers of the journey, the greatest threat came from something unseen: disease. It ravaged wagon trains with terrifying speed, often wiping out entire families before they reached their destination. The most feared and deadly of these illnesses was cholera, a bacterial infection that spread through contaminated water and food. Once infected, pioneers suffered from severe dehydration caused by relentless diarrhea and vomiting. Many perished within hours, their bodies buried hastily by grieving companions who had no time to properly mourn. Cholera was not the only killer. Dysentery, another waterborne disease, was common due to poor sanitation and a lack of clean drinking water. Smallpox outbreaks also occurred, devastating those who had no immunity. Typhoid fever, spread by contaminated food and water, claimed even more lives. With little medical knowledge and few supplies, the only remedies were folk cures, which often did more harm than good. The best defense was luck. Those who drank from untainted water sources and maintained strict hygiene had a better chance of survival. Wagon trains became mobile graveyards. It was common for pioneers to wake up each morning, dig graves for the dead, and continue their journey, leaving behind makeshift wooden crosses. Some travelers documented the horror of seeing fresh graves lining the trail, each one marking another family's loss. River crossings. The peril of the waters crossing rivers was one of the most dangerous and unpredictable parts of the journey. Some rivers were shallow and easy to wade across, but others were deep, fast-moving, and swollen with spring runoff. For those rivers, pioneers had three choices: ford, float, or wait. Fording the river meant guiding the oxen and wagons directly through the water. If the riverbed was too soft or the current too strong, wagons could overturn, trapping passengers and supplies beneath the surface. Floating across using rafts or makeshift boats was an alternative, but it required skill. If a raft was unstable or poorly built, it could break apart, sending people and possessions downstream. Waiting for the water levels to drop was often the safest option, but with limited supplies and time running out before winter, delays could be costly. Drownings were heartbreakingly common. One misstep by an ox, one strong gust of wind, or one panicked moment could mean death. Entire families were lost in a single crossing, their possessions sinking with them. The pioneers who made it across often had to do so without food, clothing, or essential supplies, which had been claimed by the water. Unpredictable weather. Nature's wrath. The trail stretched through varied and often harsh landscapes, where weather could turn from manageable to deadly in a matter of hours. Heat waves in the Great Plains and desert regions were unbearable. Pioneers trudged for miles under the scorching sun, their water supplies dwindling. Livestock often perished from dehydration, leaving families stranded without transportation. Thunderstorms struck suddenly, bringing flash floods, tornadoes, and lightning that set fire to dry prairie grass. Blizzards in the mountains were especially lethal. Early snows caught many travelers off guard, covering trails and making passage impossible. Some groups, trapped in the cold, resorted to burning wagon parts for warmth. In the most extreme cases, pioneers faced starvation and had to make horrifying choices, like those of the Donner Party, who resorted to cannibalism when their group became snowbound in the Sierra Nevada. Even minor weather shifts could be fatal. Hailstorms pounded travelers, injuring both humans and animals. High winds overturned wagons, snapping wagon wheels and leaving families stranded far from civilization. Accidents and human error, a constant. Threat with no doctors or hospitals, even a minor injury could become a death sentence. Wagon accidents were common. Wagons were heavy, top-heavy, and difficult to maneuver. A single misstep could cause a wagon to tip, pinning, or crushing a traveler beneath it. Children, in particular, were vulnerable, often playing too close to moving wheels and being run over. Firearms accidents happened frequently. Many pioneers were not experienced with guns, leading to misfires, accidental shootings, and wounds that quickly became infected. Livestock injuries could mean disaster. Oxen and horses were vital for pulling wagons, but injuries, exhaustion, or dehydration could cause them to collapse. Without their animals, pioneers had to abandon heavy supplies or attempt to carry them on foot. Snake bites were another ever-present danger, especially from rattlesnakes. A bite to a child or a weakened adult was often fatal, as there was no known treatment at the time. Attacks and conflicts. Myth versus reality. Hollywood has often depicted the Oregon Trail as a place of constant battles between pioneers and Native American tribes. In reality, most interactions were peaceful. Many native tribes, such as the Shoshone and Nez Perce, traded with pioneers, offering food, horses, and guidance. However, as more settlers encroached on indigenous lands, tensions grew. Some wagon trains did face violent encounters, often in retaliation for broken treaties or stolen resources. The fear of attack led many pioneers to form large groups and arm themselves heavily. Despite this, the number of deaths from conflicts was far lower than from disease, accidents, and river drownings. Survival, a test of endurance for every tragic loss. There were also stories of resilience and survival. Some pioneers endured disease and injury, crossing the vast plains and towering mountains against all odds. Others, stranded without supplies, relied on the kindness of fellow travelers or indigenous tribes to survive. The Oregon Trail was not just a journey, it was a test of human endurance, where every mile was earned through struggle, sacrifice, and sheer determination. By the time they reached the Willamette Valley in Oregon, those who survived had aged beyond their years. They had lost friends, family, and treasured possessions. But they had also carved a path for future generations, shaping the course of American history. The Oregon Trail was more than just a migration route. It was a proving ground for those willing to risk everything for a new beginning. And for many, it was a reminder that the American frontier was as deadly as it was promising. Food was a constant concern on the Oregon Trail. Pioneers had to carefully ration their supplies, hunt whenever possible, and rely on foraging when food ran low. While some wagon trains were well prepared, others found themselves starving, forced to make impossible choices to survive. Food and starvation, the daily struggle to eat. The typical diet on the trail was basic, monotonous, and often inadequate. Most pioneers packed provisions before leaving Missouri, but as the months dragged on, supplies dwindled, forcing travelers to get creative. Hardtack was the most common food item, a rock-hard, dry biscuit made of flour and water. While it lasted for months without spoiling, it often became infested with weevils. Salted pork was another staple, but it was packed in barrels of brine and quickly turned rancid in the summer heat. Dried beans, coffee, and bacon were valuable but had to be rationed carefully. Cornmeal and rice provided some variety, but cooking was difficult with limited fuel. Many pioneers turned to foraging, gathering berries, roots, and edible plants. However, not all plants were safe to eat. Some, like water hemlock, were deadly, if misidentified. Hunting and the buffalo crisis. For those who had the skills, hunting was essential. The plains were once teeming with buffalo, and a single kill could feed an entire wagon train. However, overhunting became a serious issue. Thousands of pioneers traveling west wiped out buffalo herds, disrupting the ecosystem and the lives of indigenous tribes who depended on them. When buffalo became scarce, pioneers hunted deer, antelope, and rabbits, but as the number of travelers increased, even these animals grew harder to find. Some families, desperate for food, resorted to eating their oxen, horses, or even dogs when no other options remained. The Donner Party, a nightmare in the Sierra Nevada. One of the most infamous tragedies of the Oregon Trail was the Donner Party disaster, a harrowing tale of desperation, starvation, and ultimately, cannibalism. In 1846, a group of nearly 90 pioneers set out for California but made a fateful decision. They took a so-called shortcut called the Hastings Cutoff, which was supposed to save time. Instead, it led them into an impassable, rugged, and untested route through Utah's deserts and mountains. Delays mounted, and as winter set in, the group became trapped in the Sierra Nevada mountains near what is now Donner Lake. As snow piled up, over 20 feet in some areas, supplies ran out. Families ate leather belts, oxhide, and even tree bark to stay alive. But as the weeks passed and starvation set in, some resorted to cannibalism, consuming the flesh of those who had already perished. Rescue parties eventually arrived, but by the time help came in February 1847, nearly half the group had died. Of the survivors, many never spoke of what they had endured. The Donner Party remains one of the most chilling stories of survival and tragedy in American history. Death and burial. Along the trail. Survival on the Oregon Trail was far from guaranteed. It's estimated that 1 in 10 pioneers who set out on the journey never made it to Oregon. Cholera outbreaks wiped out entire families in days. Accidents and drownings claimed many lives. Starvation and exposure took their toll in harsh environments. With no time for proper burials, the dead were often buried in shallow graves along the trail, marked with simple wooden crosses or piles of rocks. Some pioneers even buried their loved ones in the middle of the wagon path, hoping that passing wagons would prevent wolves from digging up the remains. For those who survived, every grave was a reminder of the harsh reality of the journey, a solemn testament to the price many paid for the chance at a better future. By the time the era of the Oregon Trail ended, an estimated 400,000 pioneers had made the journey westward, forever shaping the course of American history. The trail was not just a pathway to new land. It was a symbol of the country's relentless expansion, hope, and sacrifice. However, while it provided opportunities for settlers, it also had devastating consequences for the Native American tribes who had called the West home for centuries. The journey's end, who made it and who didn't, of the hundreds of thousands who set out, many never completed the trek. Disease, starvation, accidents, and exposure claimed at least 10% of travelers, leaving thousands buried along the trail. Despite the hardships, those who reached Oregon, California, and other Western territories found rich farmland, economic opportunities, and the promise of a new life. Families who settled in the Willamette Valley in Oregon helped lay the foundation for Oregon's statehood in 1859. Many continued further south into California, lured by the gold rush of 1849. Others took different routes, helping to populate what would later become Washington, Idaho, and Utah. The success of these settlers encouraged even more westward migration, leading to the rise of new cities, industries, and transportation routes that would soon replace the rugged, dangerous Oregon Trail. The Oregon Trail today, a link to the past, though. The days of wagon trains are long gone. Much of the original Oregon Trail still exists. Across the western United States, ruts left by pioneer wagons can still be seen carved into the earth, serving as a tangible reminder of the thousands who passed through. For history enthusiasts and travelers, there are numerous museums and historical sites dedicated to preserving the legacy of the Oregon Trail. Independence, Missouri, the traditional starting point, where emigrants gathered supplies before setting off. Fort Laramie, Wyoming, a key resupply post and military fort. Scotts Bluff, Nebraska, a landmark that guided pioneers westward. The National Historic Oregon Trail Interpretive Center, Oregon, a museum offering reenactments and exhibits on pioneer life. Hiking trails and driving routes now follow sections of the original trail, allowing modern visitors to walk in the footsteps of the pioneers who risked everything for a new life. The trail's lasting impact on America, the Oregon Trail was a driving force behind the expansion of the United States, but its consequences were not solely positive. While it enabled thousands of settlers to build new communities, it also contributed to one of the most tragic aspects of American history, the displacement of Native American tribes. As settlers pushed westward, native lands were taken, often without fair treaties. Conflicts erupted, leading to violent skirmishes and massacres. Indigenous populations were forcibly removed onto reservations. Tribes such as the Lakota, Cheyenne, Nez Perce, and Shoshone saw their way of life vanish as wagon trains, railroads, and towns overtook the land they had lived on for generations. The government enacted policies that restricted indigenous freedom, forcing many into poverty and dependence on government aid. Despite these hardships, Native American cultures persisted and adapted, continuing to tell their stories and fight for their rights in modern times. Today, many Native communities work to reclaim their history and educate the public about the true impact of westward expansion, the end of the trail. A turning point in history, by the 1870s, the Oregon Trail was no longer the main route west. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 made traveling to the Pacific much faster, safer, and more affordable. Instead of taking months, the journey west could now be completed in just a few days by train. Though the trail faded into history, its influence on the United States is undeniable. It was a symbol of perseverance, ambition, and exploration, but also a reminder of the costs of expansion. The pioneers who traveled it changed the landscape of America forever, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. The Oregon Trail was more than just a path. It was a test of endurance, determination, and survival. For the pioneers who risked everything. It was the chance for a new beginning, but it came at a heavy price. Thousands lost their lives to disease, accidents, starvation, and the sheer brutality of the elements. It was America's great migration story, but it also played a major role in the displacement of Native American tribes, forever altering the history of the West. Final thought: imagine standing at the edge of the frontier with only a covered wagon, limited supplies, and the unknown stretching before you. Would you have survived? Could you have endured the relentless hardships of the trail, or would you have turned back? Tell us in the comments, could you have made it on the Oregon Trail? If you enjoyed this deep dive into history, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more stories from the past.